Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACS webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Michael David, and I am pleased to be your host for today's broadcast, which is being co-produced with the Division of Chemical Health and Safety. We would love to get you involved in the discussion today, and you can share your thoughts and questions in the questions panel. You can also join the discussion on Twitter by including @Americhem Society or the hashtag ACS webinars in your tweet. The slides from today's presentation can be accessed right now in the handout section, and an invitation email to view the unedited recording from today's presentation will be sent to all registrants. It will be open for a 24-hour period, after which it will be removed, edited, and become an ACS member benefit. Our moderator for today is Ralph Stewart, the former chair of the ACS Committee on Chemical Safety and the membership chair of the Division of Chemical Health and Safety. He received his BS from Cornell University and MS in Environmental Engineering from the University of Vermont, and is currently serving at Keene State College as the Chemical Hygiene Officer. And with that, Ralph, I will turn it over to you to get us started today.
Thank you, Mike. The ACS Division of Chemical Health and Safety is very pleased to be working with to help develop laboratory safety teams, which we like to call LSTs, on their campuses. With us today are 4 leaders in this work: Sarah Zinn, Jessica Martin, Kaylee Miller, and Monica Nyanza, who are going to be talking to you about their experiences with laboratory safety teams and the ACS Division's Chemical Health and Safety's workshop, Empowering Academic Researchers to Strengthen Safety Culture. Kicking us off today will be Sarah to give us an introduction to LSTs.
Thanks, Ralph. So in recent years, teams of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers have become involved with lab safety leadership as a way of improving and promoting a positive safety culture within their departments and their institutions. These teams have come to be called laboratory safety teams, or LSTs for short. The actual structure and the objectives of LSTs can vary widely within academic institutions, but the common goal is really to offer a bottom-up approach to address systemic safety challenges that are identified by the frontline researchers themselves. The LST movement continues to grow across academic institutions, especially within the US, as more frontline researchers become aware of this approach to addressing some of these more long-standing lab safety issues. But as the spread of LSTs across the US continues, the question has been asked, what is driving busy graduate students and postdoctoral researchers to spend time developing and implementing these teams? Why would students find value in spending their time and their mental resources pursuing such efforts when the pressure to publish and graduate is so strong? Often, the proclivity is to view the foundational motivation for these teams in a fundamentally positive light. Maybe students with an interest in safety, they wish to spread that interest, or students who have experienced particularly good safety mentorship, they want to be more involved. But the more that we talk to the leaders of these teams, the more that we actually realize that often their motivation stems from difficulties that they have personally experienced, specifically in their lab spaces. There are multiple teams within these stories, of course, but one of the most prominent ones that we've encountered involves productivity losses that are due to inefficient organizational systems. So today we're bringing together the stories of 4 leaders in this space who realized through conversations that there was a commonality in their experiences. And we're wondering, do these stories ring a familiar bell for you? So the first researcher to share her story will be Dr. Jessica Martin.
Thank you, Sarah. So hello, I'm Jessica Martin, and before coming to graduate school, I had worked in a USD lab for over 3 years. I also had opportunities to do some project work with companies using their lab spaces. In both of these situations, I had experienced very well organized labs. Things were generally easy to find, and assembling what I needed to run my experiments was trivial in these environments. Then I entered my graduate school lab in an academic department. Now I'm going to share with you one story from my graduate school lab experience. Suffice it to say, I have loads of others. So when I first started getting to know my lab, I found over 100 little bottles that had various types of powders in them, all completely unlabeled. They took up an entire shelf in a negative 20 degrees Celsius freezer. In an attempt to liberate this space, I started asking around about these samples so that we could get rid of them. It turned out that these samples were left behind by a lab group that had previously occupied our lab. All of those people had been gone for years, including the PI. As a result, there was nobody present who actually knew anything about these samples. The initial solution to this was to gather them all together and shove them in a fridge we weren't really using. Except, of course, now I needed to use it. I described this situation to a few different people in our EH&S department in order to figure out what to do about them. And I was given two options. One, give all of the samples to EHS to dispose of as unknown chemicals. Now, if I did this, there would likely be a massive fee that they would be passing on to my lab group to pay. Or two, I could spend my time and my lab's resources to go through and attempt to solubilize each sample and take an NMR in order to try to determine what was in the bottles, then put them into the proper waste containers. Given the number of samples, this would take many hours of work and would cost my lab group money for the NMR time and the solvents. Now think about that for a minute. My lab group did not create these samples. We had nothing to do with their existence. Also, when my PI came to the university, shouldn't he have been given clean labs to start with? So what this has effectively meant is that those unlabeled samples sit in the Neg 20 freezer to this day. Next slide, please. So I'd like to find out from our audience right now how often this has happened to you. Have you ever actually had to deal with disposal of legacy samples or chemicals? I'm going to pass it over to Michael to launch a poll about this.
All right, now you all should see the blue question window popping up on your screen, and you can select either yes, no, or not applicable. And while you are doing that, I just want to remind you that this is an interactive webinar, and we are eager to get some questions for you that we can, or from you, that we can all answer at the end of the broadcast. So I am seeing the results come in, and I will close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, unfortunately, this is somewhat of a runaway with 89% of respondents saying yes, 9% said no, and 2% said not applicable. So with that, I will turn it back over to you.
So after all of the conversations that I have had within academia, it doesn't surprise me at all that 89% said they've absolutely had to deal with something like this before. So thank you so much for sharing that within our poll. Now, this one example of many longstanding safety issues that existed, this is only one example of many of longstanding issues that existed in my lab. And what has cropped up repeatedly as a source of frustration for me has been the money and organizational issues around safety. It is one thing to train graduate students to function safely in a lab. It is quite another to ask a graduate student to spend their time and the lab group's money to try to resolve these longstanding issues. The reason these end up being longstanding issues is that the time commitment to resolve them is unwieldy for a graduate student trying to get through their programs. Also, forcing cash-strapped labs to make decisions about whether or not to spend money on the research or on longstanding safety issues strikes me as incredibly unfair. Let's face it, no one is going to give me a PhD for having organized freezers. What this means is that any initiative or personal responsibility that I exhibited to clean up the legacy messes in my lab was time being taken away from me for the research that would lead to my doctorate. And since there was a clear history of this type of work not being valued, it was also unlikely that any of these efforts would be maintained by others while I was there or after I left. And this is exactly why I think the establishment of an LST is important. By enabling leadership from graduate and postdoctoral researchers, we can bring our peers together and intentionally discuss these issues. We can find out what issues are just a matter of connecting people to the right resources that already exist, and what issues are not being addressed by current resource allocation. This also gives us the opportunity as graduate researchers to practice thinking about how to improve the safe operations of our labs. This is a critical skill to develop while in these programs, so that we have this skill when we move on to running labs of our own, whether in academia, government, or industry. Additionally, we are all too easily dismissed as individuals. There is power to be had in a collective. The power in this collective not only applies to your own department, but also applies across departments and across universities. This is also why it has been vital to talk to graduate students tackling these issues at other institutions. And in that spirit, I will now hand the mic over to our next researcher, Dr. Kaylee Miller, to share her story of what led her to LSTs.
Thank you, Jessica. So my story for why I became involved in student lab safety teams has two parts, but before I start, I'd like to say that there can be a hesitancy sometimes to share these stories about safety because we don't want to feel like we're outing our place of work as an unsafe space. You know, as we saw from our last poll, it's actually important to realize that most of these problems are common in all academic institutions, and through open communication about these common issues, we are making it a safer space. So these are really difficult problems to solve, and it will take a lot of smart people putting their minds together to drive change. So for the first story, I will preface it by saying in undergrad, I had gained experience working both with established and developing safety programs at Dow Corning internships and a small nanochemistry startup, kind of like Jessica, where they had pretty established safety protocols. And when I started my PhD at the University of Illinois in a research group, I was the only chemist among other chemical and materials engineers. So with my safety experience and my scientific background, it was natural that I became the lab manager after my first year. And in the lab that I was in, every grad student had to go through this series of online trainings before working in the lab, and they had to be renewed each year. And in addition, we had several lab-specific trainings led by super users that were in charge of maintaining the SOPs, scheduling, upkeep. So on paper, you know, the training system actually seems like a really good system, and most of the time it was. However, there was a lot of, you know, there wasn't a lot of documentation or training for those claiming leadership roles like I was going into. So it was a very learn as you go kind of approach. So things inevitably slip through the cracks. For example, I think probably I got through over a year in my role before finding out what and where our university chemical hygiene plan was. And in addition, my responsibilities weren't fully outlined in a way that was obvious to me. So I didn't know that we had to do, for example, eye wash and fire extinguisher checks until after my first lab audit, when we didn't have records over the past year. So this kind of boggled my mind, because I'm coming from a place where I was pretty motivated to do a good job, and you seemingly have this very good infrastructure, and then there's, because of some disconnect, there was a major thing missed, even though you have the best intentions. So that got my gears turning. You know, how does this happen? So, so my second example is about chemical organization, and through several different annual audits and mid-year check-ins, we had a recurring violation of keeping updated lists of chemicals or hazards present in each lab. The other chemistry buildings created an inventory program to keep up with this. And so they would have barcodes, and people would go through the building once the year's updated. But because my research building wasn't in a primary chemistry building, and it was actually a collaborative research center, we did not have this system. So I spent a lot of time working with our facilities and EH&S staff to come up with solutions. And we went through and pulled every chemical out and reorganized our storage, making sure things were properly contained and had compatibilities, and you know, limiting the amount of flammable liquids in one room. You know, I could go on. And so this was probably one of my biggest projects outside of my research. And in the end, we were able to create this cloud-based list of chemicals in our labs, but it's questionable if it was kept up after I left. And again, I find myself asking how this happens. How was it that I was, you know, in charge of this? So those are my two stories. And to see how many of you the second story resonates, I will turn this over to Michael for the poll.
All right, and our second poll question for everyone is, have you ever had to work with poorly maintained or non-existent chemical inventory system? And your possible responses are yes, or no, or that this question isn't applicable to you. So I'm going to give you all a few more moments to enter in the results. And just a reminder, we are excited to get your questions for the Q&A session at the end. And with that, I am going to close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it looks like this is another runaway question, with 91% saying yes, 7% saying no, and 1% saying not applicable. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Michael. So thanks for those of you that have participated in the poll, you know, we kind of picked these because we thought most people would have shared experiences. And I could go on for a while about reasons that I've become more and more interested in academic lab safety. But for me, it seems like recurring problems that I've seen are a lack of communication and a lack of acknowledging the prevalence of human error. So if you think about how these things are structured in these environments, what's important is to really understand how to make it easy for people to do the things they're supposed to do, and in many cases, things that they want to do, rather than hoping someone will remember things from an online training 4 years ago, or assuming they'll be able to find resources on their own to help them do their job. So if you think of my stories, the faculty and staff really did try and help develop systems that were sustainable, but there was a disconnect in the end with how workers actually go about their day. And it's easy at this point to become defeated or to give up because there's this huge time commitment that was given, and still improvements are needed at the end. So solving these problems does take a lot of trial and error and persistence on the part of both students and faculty. And the solutions that work are totally dependent on the unique environments at each institution. So something that really helped was getting involved in safety groups to see what others did to solve similar problems. I helped launch the safety team at my institution, even though I didn't hold one of the executive leadership positions. I was also appointed to the National ACS Committee on Chemical Safety and volunteered with this group, the ACS Division of Chemical Safety. And in these groups, I wanted to contribute my expertise, but noticed there wasn't a lot of work being done in this space. So I created this workshop to connect people and develop future leaders like Jessica and Sarah and Monica. So knowing the workshop is in good hands, I kind of sit on the sidelines more, but in my current role, I work for Stanford University as the Shared Facilities Research Safety Specialist. But I try and be involved in any way that I can because these are still so relevant in my current role. All right, with that, I will be turning it over to the next researcher to share her story. Sarah Zinn.
Thanks, Kaylee. So like others here, my journey to working with safety teams is rooted very deeply in personal experiences and a drive to improve conditions. So I'm a first-generation STEM major and a first-generation graduate student. I entered graduate school kind of starry-eyed and intimidated, and I also had wildly inaccurate expectations, which were calibrated to the overly positive public-facing front that's kind of depicted here in this slide. Next slide, please, Kaylee. So when I first joined my group, I was pretty struck by how inefficiently everything ran, how dirty everything was, and how little anything was documented. Learning pretty much anything in my lab was entirely through word of mouth from senior students to junior students. We didn't have inventory of our chemicals, of our equipment, or of our laser optics. I was starting a new project in the lab, and I wasn't working with a senior student on this project. So it was up to me to go through our lab, drawer by drawer, cabinet by cabinet, and take stock of what we had and what we didn't have so that I could purchase what I needed. Next slide. So in an attempt to help my lab function more smoothly, I inventoried everything as I went. I created an online searchable chemical inventory for our group, but it wasn't just our inventory system that stood in my way. Our space, especially our hoods, was very disorganized and dirty. Next slide. Hot plates were on and unused for who knows how long. Tubing had fallen and melted on the hot plates and on the bench. Unknown substances were in the hood and on the counter in old unlabeled beakers. And the waste disposal was poorly documented, it was full, and it was confusing. Since I was going to be spending most of my foreseeable future in this space, I spent much of my entire second year cleaning up this legacy mess. A year into joining the group, I was struggling to keep up with the work that would actually get me my PhD, because I was constantly trying to maintain our shared space, and I found myself mostly alone in my attempts. I couldn't work in the environment that I was in, but I was also only harming myself by spending exorbitant amounts of time trying to maintain a functional space in an environment that wasn't obviously valued work. Meanwhile, the time for annual online safety training would come around again, and everyone I knew, and even myself, would skip to the quiz at the end to kind of check that administrative box. annual lab inspections would roll around, and everyone would spend the week before throwing unknown legacy samples into drawers and otherwise cleaning up the lab space just enough to pass inspection and then forget about it for the rest of the year. So this really made me wonder, how common is this situation? So I want to ask you about your experiences, and I'll turn it over to Michael to launch a quiz.
All right, and our next quiz for you is, how often have you encountered a disruptive equipment mess or chemical contamination that was produced by a previous occupant of your lab space? Was it too many times, a few times, never, or this question isn't applicable to you? And I'm going to leave this question open for a little bit longer to give a chance for more of you to respond. All right, here they come. So we will be closing this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This one isn't quite as much as a runaway, with 60% saying too many times, 32% saying a few times, 6% saying never, lucky you, and 2% saying not applicable. And with that, I will turn it back over to you.
So those results don't really surprise me from conversations that I've had at my institutions. That's kind of along the lines of what I've experienced too. So it was at this point in my journey where I started considering how widespread this issue was that I realized that this is really more of a systemic issue that needs addressing on a much larger scale than just in my own lab space. So I have so much company in this experience, and I wouldn't really be able to make a dent, let alone a long-term improvement, just by temporarily cleaning up the lab space that I inherited. This goes beyond individuals. I think it comes down to finding solutions and structures that work for the people who are actually using them. So to try to make more of a long-term efficient change, I co-founded our lab safety team to try to address these issues in a way that I, as a graduate student, could actually accomplish. A lot of what I was seeing on the ground was a mismatch between what researchers need and what they experience and what information they have, a mismatch with that from what administration wants and needs and the administrative structure. So I really saw lab safety teams as a way to bridge that mismatch and a way to bring the safety needs of researchers to the table. I saw it as a good space, a good accessible space that was visible to students, where we could talk about and address the practical issues that we actually experience day to day in our labs. For me, it was a place to start visibly having these conversations and a place where all of our different motivations and interests could crystallize into a common goal. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our last speaker today, Monica Nienza, to share a bit about the experiences that have led her to getting involved with LSTs.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so my story is pretty much similar to everything you've heard so far. So when I started graduate school, that was in 2018, I found myself in a lab where both people I met were in their final year, and so they were almost out of the door. I got the opportunity to watch them work and also to work with them. I mean, one thing I realized immediately was how poor the housekeeping in the lab was, that I kept questioning if there was any time they stopped to clean up the lab during their entire period in the lab they were working in. But it became obvious to me that that wasn't the situation. And then there was my first safety inspection by EHS, which is an annual inspection. And I was so eager to clean the lab because to me, I thought that was part of the reason for the inspection. When I started figuring out how to properly get rid of some things in the lab, one of the senior lab members just told me to shove them in the drawers. Hiding things in the drawers because the safety professionals are not going to go through them didn't sit well with me, but that is what I did. After the inspection, the safety reports on their findings and what needed to be fixed in the lab, safety-wise, came to my then advisor in a long email. When the report came in, the other student was also leaving, and hence I was the only one left in the lab. And that meant I had to spend most of my first and second year cleaning up the lab and bringing it to some acceptable safety standard. This included getting rid of waste, making an inventory system for the chemicals, making hard copies for SOPs we used in the lab, cleaning the fridge and labeling stuff. It was nice having the EHS department help me out with what to do when I had a question about waste management and how to discard chemicals in general. While I am proud of the work that I did to make this lab safe for future grad students, this work also robbed me of considerable time when I should have been preparing for teaching, studying for my own classes, and working on my research. Also, given that good housekeeping was never a big part of the lab, I suspected that as soon as I was gone, none of the work I had done would be reviewed or maintained. And then I started running experiments in the lab. I quickly realized how lonely and tough it was to not know much about the safety of what you are doing. Most of my chemical safety knowledge at that point was from the safety course, which is mandatory for all first-year grad students in our department. When I needed help with the experimental portion, I could consult with my colleagues in other organic labs to help me with it, but we never really discussed the safety aspect of the experiment. Looking back and knowing what I know now, I'm sure there were many things I did on the advice of my colleagues that were unsafe or unwise. Since we had all been through the same limited safety training, we all had similar gaps in our knowledge. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mike to handle the poll for this section.
All right, and for our final poll, we have this question. Have you ever contacted safety professionals for help with specific questions about research safety or hazardous waste issues in your lab? And your possible responses are yes, they were helpful. Yes, they were not helpful. No, I haven't needed them. Or no, I don't know anyone I can contact. And finally, not applicable. Give you a few more moments to read through the possible responses here. And I will be closing this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, luckily 72%, the largest portion, said yes, they were helpful. 9% said they were not helpful. 7% said no, they haven't needed them. 5% said no, they don't know anyone they can contact. And 7% said not applicable. And with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I am really glad to see that a lot of people get help when they contact EHS, because they can be really good allies when it comes to safety, your safety in the lab. So this got me thinking about how my experience can't be an isolated incident. I mean, what if there are others within the department in similar situations? How do we help each other to safely do the science we love so much? And then our new department chair sponsored several graduate students, me included, to attend the ACS Chemical Health and Safety Workshop on empowering academic researchers to strengthen safety culture. That group, which attended this workshop and were inspired by the stories that were shared, started having safety-related discussions together with the department chair, the chemical hygiene officer of the department, and EHS personnel, which has become a monthly meeting now, and formally now an LST, which is a lab safety team. I believe this provides us with a platform as graduate students to have a united voice and also to learn from each other when it comes to safety. I mean, I finally changed labs for other reasons. And in my new lab, I started conversations related to safety with my new lab mates, which includes something as simple as telling each other the reactions we are running and some of the associated risks, as well as discussing safety issues present in the lab as a way of creating and maintaining a strong, positive local lab culture, which we can then share with other labs within the department. So with that, I will hand it over to Jessica Martin.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Now, first, I want to thank this group of researchers for being willing to publicly share their struggles here today. When sharing our stories with one another, we realized that all of us had experienced our research productivity being undermined by housekeeping challenges that had gotten out of control long before we had arrived. We all had expectations that we were entering our graduate research labs to learn how to be effective researchers, and that this training would include how to effectively manage a lab to support research productivity. However, it quickly became clear that our individual labs were not where we were going to learn these vital lessons. And as we talked to more and more graduate researchers, we also discovered that these challenges were not isolated to our specific labs. Housekeeping challenges are a systemic issue throughout academic research labs, and the people who suffer most from these challenges are the frontline graduate and postdoctoral researchers. Both their limited time and their personal health and safety are impacted by poor lab-wide housekeeping. Now, as the frontline researchers working in these labs, we are the experts on how these challenges disrupt our progress. However, as temporary workers within this system, we control neither the resources nor the rules that are needed to address these challenges. While there are many safety professionals who would not be surprised by the stories we shared above, we have found that even though most of the problems are often acknowledged as systemic, proposed solutions are still only focused on individual actions. Next slide, please. So LSTs have functioned as a vehicle to bring together graduate and postdoctoral researchers to share their experience with one another so that they can discover what particular issues are systemic within their departments. This has functioned differently from those faculty committees to which 1 or 2 graduate researchers are invited. While this may appear to be representation, graduate researchers on these committees typically have the least power, the least influence, and can easily be intimidated into silence. An LST changes this dynamic, allowing graduate researchers to find their voice among their peers struggling with the same challenges. Engaged safety professionals and faculty members have functioned as champions for LSTs, taking the issues identified by LSTs seriously and securing the audiences and resources necessary to begin to address these systemic issues. The issues identified are typically not easy to address. If they were easy to address, then they would have been resolved long ago. However, this working relationship between LSTs and their champions is creating a space in which graduate and postdoctoral researchers are learning how to identify safety issues in their lab and ask for help. And champions are learning what broader issues actually do undermine safety in research labs and how to address them more effectively. Next slide, please. So we are also working with CHAS to develop ways for graduate and postdoctoral researchers to talk to one another about these issues across universities. Dr. Kaylee Miller mentioned the workshop she founded and led on behalf of CHAS to be conducted at the ACS National Meeting in 2018. We have created a page on the CHAS website sharing the history and development of this workshop shown here. I began working with her to continue this workshop starting in 2019. Next slide, please. So I took over as the leader of these workshops just as the COVID lockdown forced the cancellation of in-person events. Instead of throwing in the towel, I worked with a group of graduate students as the workshop leader to redevelop this workshop to be delivered virtually. Sarah then played a major role in that redevelopment and won, as part of this team of graduate students, the first ever CHAS Graduate Student Safety Leadership Award in 2021 in recognition of this work, as well as the work she was doing leading her LST at her own institution. Next slide, please. Monica Nyanza began supporting the workshop starting in the beginning of 2021 and will be taking over as workshop leader for the workshops in 2022. The workshop will continue to be held virtually 3 times per year. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this workshop, you can visit the CHAS workshops page on the CHAS website and look for the one called Empowering Academic Researchers to Strengthen Safety Culture. Additionally, Monica has worked with division leaders to curate another page on the site called Lab Safety Team Resources in order to gather together useful publications for those interested in starting or strengthening their own LSTs. Finally, we have started a workspace on Slack called Lab Safety Teams, where LST leaders from all over can communicate and share ideas. Thank you for attending this webinar and listening to our stories, as well as answering our polls to share your stories as well, and we're happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we're ready now to begin the conversation in response to the questions from the audience. The first question I would like to start with is for Monica. Somebody says that they're interested in developing a student-led lab safety team on their campus. What do you think is a good first step in that process?
Yeah, thank you, Raf. So I would say the first step will be to let them attend the ACS Chemical Health and Safety workshop, because I mean, personally, that is how I got involved with everyone who is on this webinar today. And it has been a really useful resource, like where to even start from. And I would also suggest that since you are willing to support these students, also be willing to be a champion for them, because most times you need, for LSTs to really function, you need a champion. You need somebody who is willing to advocate for these teams. You need somebody who is willing to support, who is willing to give advice, and who is willing to protect these grad students, I mean, in certain situations. So that would be my 2 cents.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that question?
Yeah, a great way to get started with LSTs too is actually the workshop that Jessica mentioned. So, you know, encouraging students to go together and attend this workshop and kind of hear other stories from LST leaders and get, you know, a checklist of next steps. I think that's a really great place to start.
Thank you. Jessica, so it sounds like one of your driving forces to get involved is housekeeping, chemical inventory. Are there other kinds of hazards that arose as the work went forward and that you were sort of called on to address as a lab safety team?
Sure. We focused a lot on talking about housekeeping because in so many situations, it really is the root of all of the other accidents that happen. You know, we had a lot of issues within our department in which we talked about accidentally flooding labs, right? Where we talked about accidentally setting things on fire, where we talked about people slipping and falling and injuring themselves really badly when things got put together in a hood that weren't supposed to be put together, and now you've got a fire, right? Like the root cause of all of these things is that stuff just isn't being put back where it belongs, you know, and then things just aren't being cleaned up. And if it was being cleaned up, you know, it just feels like over 90% of those things wouldn't happen. The example with flooding labs, you know, one of my fellow lab mates did this. He didn't use the correct clamps on the tubing. Why? He couldn't find them. Okay, you know, he couldn't find them in our disastrous, messy lab, and the stockroom was already closed downstairs. He was having to work on the weekend. He just wanted to get it done, and that is repeated over and over and over again. It's not that they're dumb and don't know. It's that they were just hoping it would work. And let's face it, most of the time it does, right? Most of the time it doesn't result in a flood, and so you can usually get away with it. So that's one of the reasons why so many of us are harping on this idea of really focusing on housekeeping, because you can eliminate so many hazards simply by putting things away and cleaning things up and having an organized process to do that.
Okay, thank you. Kaylee, how can lab safety teams complement services provided by institutional environmental health and safety staff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important to emphasize that in this structure that the student LST isn't looking to step into like a responsible training function like faculty members, or to take responsibility for environmental health and safety compliance functions. So these teams are meant to function in addition to and in collaboration with both of these pre-existing structures. So unfortunately, depending on like the size of the EHS team and the funding they have available and the emphasis of being involved in safety amongst faculty, the support that those groups can provide may be more or less. So student safety teams have differing structures and different objectives depending on the institution's organizations and needs and resources. So overall, these tend to focus on improving the culture of safety in research-intensive science departments. So that involves enabling leadership by graduate student and postdoctoral associate lab safety officers, and just getting everyone to, you know, communicate together, like we had said, I think in Jessica's closing.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I've always been an institutional EHS professional myself, and it's been an ongoing challenge to connect to the grad students because they are so busy with so many responsibilities. And so people willing to take on this work is really valuable to those of us doing that role as well. Sarah, do you think that this model could be used in the classroom setting, for example, for graduate student teaching assistants or for the students in the class to help them improve their safety performance?
Yeah, so I think there's actually a number of different ways that these types of programs could be implemented specifically in classrooms. So, one possibility is for, the LST that exists already within the greater department to interface with teaching assistants in classrooms directly. So some existing LSTs already have these kinds of programs. For example, some are working to enhance the way that safety is taught to undergraduates. Some are engaging teaching assistants directly in how to respond to incidents in the teaching lab in a way that's motivated by peer experience. Some have peer-to-peer workshopping with teaching assistants about how to begin and follow through with conversations about safety behavior to their students. But another possibility might be to actually adapt these types of LSTs, these types of hands-on peer-led programs specifically for the classroom. So this approach has actually been reported, I think, in the Journal of Chemical Education for a program that was developed at Seattle University. So in that program, they really tried to make a classroom-focused form of an LST where students worked together as a cohesive group to lead pre-lab presentations on safety, to monitor lab practices while the lab was occurring, and then also to inspect their lab spaces post-lab. So I definitely encourage anyone who's interested in adapting the LST model specifically for classrooms to look at that JChemEd paper. I think it was published in 2010.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, this isn't necessarily classroom-based, but one of the follow-on impacts we had once we started to organize as an LST and really have these conversations in terms of what mentorship did we wish we had, what organizational structure did we wish we had. The undergraduate researchers that came into our labs became the guinea pigs to start experimenting with whether this worked out well or not. And for us, it was also just incredibly revelatory and a great thing to document to prove to others in the system that it really is about just providing a good example. Undergraduate researchers coming into the lab, they're very rarely there to be rebellious, right? They're there to find out what it is to be a researcher, and they're looking at you, the graduate student, to teach them. And then the graduate student is looking at their PI and not necessarily getting a whole lot of guidance depending on who your PI is. And so this idea that that we're defying safety rules because we're all just rebellious and crazy, it has nothing to do with that. Very little to do with it. We really are looking at what we're supposed to be doing and trying to be good scientists. So there's a lot to be said for how people are showing others what a good scientist looks like.
Thank you. Monica, somebody wonders, do you think it's advisable to separate safety leadership in the lab from the more general responsibilities of a laboratory manager?
That's a good question. I mean, I will let Kaylee comment on that later because she's been a lab manager before. But I don't think that is two different things to be separated. I mean, a lab manager sort of have control, sort of sees everything, like the overall activities in the lab, and that also includes safety, like making sure that people are working safely and having the all the PPEs that they need to do their work. Okay, and I know in recent years there's been the lab safety officers positions where there's a lab that chooses one person who makes sure that the lab is sort of up to safety standard, like you are not acting like a policing people around, but making sure that the hazardous waste are taken out on time, that people have the PPEs that they need, that SOPs, there are SOPs for all the things that people are doing. So I think lab manager is big as like you are It's somebody who is in charge of the lab, making sure equipment are working, like everything, including safety, is working. But as a researcher who is also working with chemicals and different equipment, that comes with safety issues. I think have that safety. It's not something to skills as a researcher.
Thanks, Monica. No, that was a great.
Yeah, Kelly, if you want to add something.
Yeah, that was a really great description. I think the only thing I'll add is that a lot of the time I've seen looks like we lost Monica. So a lot of the time you'll have lab managers and even the lab safety officers be part of the leadership team. It's actually kind of, you could see it kind of like a funnel, you know, for training for people that, you know, first they're involved as a lab safety officer, and then they learn some and they want to get involved in the bigger organizational. I think that's more commonly how it happens. But if your lab already has a safety officer and you also want to be involved in safety, there's nothing stopping you from doing that as well. So, and you know, some labs don't have lab managers, some labs have both a lab manager and a safety officer. So it really just depends on, you know, your interests and the lab's interests and, you know, how it's structured.
Yeah. I also did just want to add to this. The way that this terminology gets used, depending on what kind of your lab you're in, it was very interesting for me. When I was working in the lab I was in at the USDA, we had a lab manager. It was her full-time job to be a lab manager. So when we needed things ordered, we went to her. When inspections needed to be organized, we went to her. She was also responsible for the training of all of the researchers in the lab. Now, having her exist didn't somehow, you know, vanquish my responsibilities for safety, right? So it was not her job to follow me around and clean up after me. That was my job. But because everybody knew that was their job, people did clean up after themselves and alerted to her to anything that they needed. And so if we had something not working, we went to go talk to her about it. And she got things organized. Now, coming into academia, of course, you're seeing very different organizational structures in that. Some people do have full-time staff lab managers. I did not work in a department that was like that at all. And so this idea that a graduate student is going to be assigned this role, it sounds very daunting to me without something giving somewhere, you know, and just in terms of the demands on their time. I was also in a department where most students were teaching assistants for their stipends. And so we all had heavy teaching schedules. We all had heavy, you know, we had our classes to take for the first years, and then we had to do our research. On top of this, giving somebody that role to be the lab manager, if you're going to give them that broader role, you know, some other responsibility needs to go away. And it just doesn't seem fair to layer that on top of that graduate student, on top of everything else.
Yeah, I think I'd also like to add that there's a portion to this that comes with a high turnover rate in academia. So if you're trying to make the lab manager position somebody like a graduate student who kind of comes and goes on a short term relative to the lifespan of the lab, I think it is something that needs to be considered, not necessarily, you know, separating safety leadership from the lab manager role, but maybe separating organizational structure of what it means to be, you know, a lab manager from the actual position. So maybe, you know, implementing some things that are more long-lived or long-term than just the individual in the position, so that they can come in and there's a very documented, you know, onboarding and offboarding procedure, and things like that, if you're going to have a high turnover rate of lab managers.
It's a very good point. I just want to append to that. The one person who isn't high turnover in that lab is the PI, right?
Well, PI has 6 years to not be high turnover if they're under pressure during that period. Jessica, what, if any, is the gender breakdown of the researchers who are participating in the LSTs? As a safety professional, the person who's asking the question is sensitive to recognizing that the majority role women play in the non-promotable tasks associated with lab work. If there's a gender discrepancy, how can we start to address that?
So first of all, while I know you're looking at 4 women on this call today, we've actually found across a lot of different teams that the disparity is not quite this extreme, right? There are actually quite a few males who are also involved in the LST movement. Some of the explanation for that, I do think, is the fact that a lot of people come to LSTs, in addition to the things that we've talked about, because we have heard the rumors that industry cares, and that we do need to make sure that in some way we are proving on our CVs that we have taken safety seriously, we have gotten the training, and it does matter. And I've certainly, like I've observed, I don't have hard numbers on this, but I have observed that the places where there are companies that are saying, yes, this matters to us, and so Dow is a big one, ExxonMobil down south is another one, you will see more male involvement, which I don't think is good, bad, or indifferent. It is, and it's, you know, it makes sense, right, to put time and effort into something that is ultimately going to get you a job, as it should be. You know, I'm glad that that's the influence that they're having here, right? In terms of balancing things out, I mean, I think a big part of this is where champions can really step in, and where it is important to really utilize and take advantage of these teams for what they are. As Ralph had mentioned earlier, these teams can be really useful for the EH&S professional. While EH&S professionals are pulled a million different ways, and they have to cover so many different things, having a group of researchers to come together and say, these are the trainings we actually need, could be incredibly useful, and in some starting ways is useful at now my alma mater, that we're really starting to communicate that so that we can make safety training more useful. And I think once you like build more utility into that, you're going to attract more researchers generally, and you probably will attract more male researchers relative to female researchers as a result.
Yeah, I'd like to, that was all great. I'd like to just add also that I think a lot of schools now are looking at how to acknowledge the work that is being done by these people more, you know, like give them a stipend in addition, because it's it's unrecognized work a lot of the time, and even they're fighting against people that think it's a waste of time. So giving them more power, more authority in any way that you can in the university is one thing that probably will help quite a bit if we are talking about gender imbalance, because or I think awards or grants or something like that, some kind of time where they're put in a place where they're sufficiently acknowledged for their work.
Thank you both for sharing those thoughts. So we sort of pointed in the direction that people are asking about, is how do you manage the people that are, a lab safety team is usually does not have administrative responsibilities. I think somebody said that it sort of disclaimed this administrative responsibilities. How do you manage administration who may have other priorities than housekeeping or safety training or whatever? I'll throw it open, or does somebody want to volunteer to answer that one?
Yeah, I'll take this question if I understand it correctly. And I also saw some other questions, asked in the chat about principal investigators and people who maybe aren't so interested in this space, and make it perhaps difficult for people to get involved in such administrative things. And I think it really comes down to motivation. So I think really everybody is motivated to engage in these kinds of teams and this kind of administrative safety behavior for different reasons. So, graduate students have different reasons to be motivated to engage in this kind of thing, but also PIs do have a reason, even though it might not be obviously clear to them. So, as a society, we often don't talk about safety in this manner, but kind of, the whole point of our conversation today is that there's productivity losses to safety issues in the lab. And, even though PIs might not be in a headspace to recognize that or think about that, I think we can make it clear to them, and we can make the point that there are definitely productivity losses. And, if we can work to make a better safety environment and be involved in these kinds of higher level organizational teams, that in the long run, we can increase the efficiency of your lab. And I think, each of us professionals have a different motivation, but really just all coming together from different perspectives to achieve the same goal. I think it's just making that motivation clear from all different perspectives.
And I think that's one of the reasons that Chaz, as a technical division, is very interested in this work, because I think what you just talked about is a safety culture, right? Is being able to bring different perspectives together in a functional way around a particular topic. And Chaz has been increasingly interested in safety culture as an object of study for the last 10 years. And I think that you guys have been very valuable in helping us to address that issue. So I think we're getting close to the end of the time. I'll just ask one more question here. Several people are asking about how do we identify the most sustainable opportunities for LSTs, systemic changes that are impactful and sustainable over time. Kaylee, do you want to take a stab at that one?
That's a hard question. I think that's the challenge, that it might need to be a little bit trial and error, because there's a lot of things that these safety teams can do, and usually things that are like one-off and led by the passion of one person are really good to pursue, because there's an overlap in the interest of the individual and of the group, but things to watch for is if it's consistently only one person, that's not going to be sustainable. So something where it's addressing the needs that a lot of different labs have, things that overlap already with the work that people are going to be doing, things that they're going to be spending time on anyways. So this is why we talk about housekeeping, or have talked about housekeeping throughout here, is because that is a huge time to traction, right? And so things like that will be useful no matter what. I'm kind of drawing a blank other than trial and error with these kinds of things. I don't know if any of you all have more thoughts. Yeah,
so I would say definitely leveraging the growing network that exists between these LSTs that already exist. So like Jessica Martin talked about, there's again the workshop, but then there's also the Slack channel that we have started, where you can really talk to people who've been kind of knee deep in these things already and have done this trial and error already. You don't necessarily need to reinvent that wheel. So you can talk to people and see what has been done, what has worked for them, what kinds of structures they have, and what they've learned through those things. And I think, definitely leveraging existing information that's already out there through these networks is important. And there's also a growing literature on LST formation and different projects that different LSTs have done, and whether they've struggled with them or not. So there's a growing literature in ACS chemical health and safety about this too. So definitely looking at that.
Well, while you were talking, I realized also if you have support from your faculty and administration, those are the things that are going to be far more likely to be successful, because you have top-down support for programs versus bottom-up. So when you can marry those two interests, those will be the most successful.
So I think we're getting ready to close here. Do we go around the table and just ask people for closing thoughts? Jessica?
Sure. This is to faculty and safety professionals. There's a lot of cool stuff that's been happening within the safety professional space, where ideas on this have been evolving over the last few decades. So this is a great time for these two groups to find each other and start talking. And I'll just say, graduate students care about these things more than they are typically given credit for. So let them into the conversation as partners. They may not have something to contribute initially, but by giving them verbal space and building trust, you will soon find what I've found. And that's that there's all these just incredibly intelligent, highly perceptive, very dedicated individuals who are more than willing to be part of the solution.
Great, thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, so I would say that in my experience, really the problems that you're facing or that you feel like you're facing as an individual in your lab space are probably much bigger and much more systemic than you initially think. So having conversations with people around you and being open and honest about the challenges that you faced, I think can only help everything improve from there.
Thank you. Monica?
Okay, so I would say there is power in teamwork. Talk with your fellow grad students, really, just start talking. You don't have to do this alone, please. It's a lot of work. So.
Thank you. Kelly?
I'm going to just say the same thing. You know, I mean, don't reinvent the wheel. If there are other groups that do things that work, you know, just take a little time to reach out and ask, but it's definitely worth it in the end.
Thank you all very much for your work and for sharing your work with us. David, I think you're ready to close us out.
Yeah, well, I'd also like to thank you, Ralph, Jessica, Callie, Monica, and Sarah for joining us today and sharing your knowledge about lab safety and productivity. If you enjoyed today's topic, make sure you check out the many other webinars that we have done on safety in the ACS Webinars Library. Before we sign off, we'd like to invite everyone to these free upcoming broadcasts. How do you match your personal skills with job requirements in order to thrive in the ever-changing job market? You can join us on November 10th for a special broadcast for those that reside in India to learn about choosing a career based on personal strengths and values. Also on November 10th, we're having a conversation with industry experts on building sustainability into every innovation from the ground up. Learn about the future of sustainable innovations being developed in corporate research and development. And then the next day on November 11th, how can you enrich the student experience in your classroom? Join us to discover how to provide more interconnected learning and teaching in chemistry through this approach. We would love to hear what you think about our broadcast. You can reach out to us through the ACS social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, or by email at acswebinars@acs.org. And as always, we are curious to hear what you thought of today's broadcast, and a short survey will pop up directly after the webinar that will just take a minute to complete. Also remember that an invitation email to view the unedited recording from today's presentation will be sent to all registrants. It will be open for a 24-hour period, after which it will be removed, edited, and become an ACS member benefit, where you can find it at acs.org. And that wraps up our program for today. On behalf of all of us here at ACS, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a good day, everyone.